Three holes cut into a cave floor may hold the oldest clues we have to human brewing. You could stand right beside them and never notice, because inside those holes, the origin story of alcohol may be hiding or coming apart. They're in Raqefet Cave in the Levant, deep mortars carved into bedrock by Natufian hunter-gatherers around 13,000 years ago. No drink is left, no recipe either, just worn stone and microscopic traces of plants. Honestly, that does not sound like much to work with. But this is what the beginning of alcohol looks like when almost everything useful has disappeared. Most of us picture that beginning much later. Fields of grain, clay jars, Mesopotamian cities, somebody, somewhere, finally making beer on purpose. The problem is, that picture squeezes several different moments into one answer. One moment is the first time one of our ancestors encountered ethanol. Another is the first time people deliberately created the conditions for fermentation. Then there is the oldest alcoholic product archaeology can recognize with reasonable confidence. Those moments may sit very far apart, and the first one does not even need humans. A ripe piece of fruit splits open. Yeasts reach the sugar and begin converting it, producing ethanol and carbon dioxide. Tiny bubbles rise in the juice. Fermentation is already happening. No instructions required. Animals can eat that fruit. Our ancestors may have done the same. There is also genetic evidence that an ancestral primate enzyme became better at processing ethanol millions of years ago. That matters, but it is not a drinking date. A body that can metabolize ethanol does not prove anyone went looking for it. Eating fermented fruit does not prove brewing, and brewing does not automatically mean intoxication was the goal. Each step asks for different evidence. So the mystery really begins when people stop simply finding fermentation and begin controlling it. With grain, that takes work. Starch is not ready for yeast. First, it has to become sugar through processes such as germination and mashing. Only then can yeast turn those sugars into ethanol. Collect, soak, crush, mix, wait. Once could be an accident. Repeat it with the same tools in the same sequence, and archaeology suddenly has a much tougher question. Is this food processing or is it brewing? Which brings us back to those three mortars at Raqefet. If the brewing interpretation is right, there is a lot of labor buried inside them. Wild cereal gathered by hand, grain carried into the cave, stone hitting stone, over and over until hard seeds became a workable mash. Then the waiting, for a change nobody could see. Nothing like a brewery we would recognize now, just people learning that time could change food. Researchers studied wear on the stone and starch granules trapped in the ancient residue. Some granules appeared altered in ways associated with germination, heating, crushing, and fermentation. The team compared them with experimentally processed grain and proposed that the mortars formed part of a brewing sequence. The cave also contained burials, so the possibility of communal or mortuary use is hard to ignore. Still, hard to ignore is not the same as proven. A burial nearby cannot tell us what people drank, why they made it, or whether they were trying to become intoxicated. A damaged starch grain cannot say beer. Even taken together, the clues still leave room for malt, porridge, storage, another fermented food, or contamination. That is an enormous amount of history balanced on three empty holes. And this is where the story starts to feel uneasy. Raqefet may preserve deliberate fermentation before agriculture. But before we call it the first brewery, we have to face the strongest objection. What exactly makes this a drink? That is the hardest question hanging over the Raqefet interpretation. And there is no single clue that settles it. There are several. The mortars come from a dated Natufian context. Their surfaces show repeated use. Plant residues survived inside the stone. Some starch granules had changed in ways the researchers compared with experimental grain processing and fermentation. Put all of that together, and deliberate fermentation starts to look plausible. The trouble comes with the word beer. That label asks more of the evidence. Whatever people made might have been thick. They may have eaten it as much as they drank it. We do not know its alcohol strength, whether it was filtered, how often it was prepared, or what the people in that cave would have called it. Archaeology did not preserve the tasting notes. Very inconsiderate. So Raqefet does not hand us a drink we can confidently identify. It gives us evidence for an early brewing interpretation, strong enough to take seriously, but uncertain enough that the label still has to remain open. Then the timeline becomes inconvenient, because beer does not get a clean victory. At Shubayqa 1, in what is now eastern Jordan, archaeologists found 24 charred bread-like remains dating to roughly 14,400 years ago. They may be slightly older than the Raqefet brewing claim. That does not mean bread was invented first. The dates overlap. The evidence survived in different forms, and neither site records the first time anyone attempted either process. What they do show is that hunter-gatherers were already grinding, mixing, soaking, and transforming wild cereals before domesticated fields took over the landscape. Maybe beer and bread were never standing on opposite sides of some prehistoric starting line. Maybe both came out of the same untidy stretch of experimentation. But that creates another problem. If Raqefet is old and disputed, why not move forward to a clearer case and simply call that the beginning? At Jiahu in central China, pottery from around 7000 BCE preserved chemical traces associated with rice, honey, and fruit. That is much stronger evidence for a mixed fermented beverage. Still, it is not a recipe. The jar cannot give us the proportions. It cannot tell us which yeast was involved, how strong the mixture became, what it tasted like, or whether people made it every week or only for a particular gathering. It tells us a fermented product existed there, no more than that. And this is where the timeline starts behaving strangely. Jiahu is later than Raqefet. The evidence is clearer. Go later again, into societies with writing, specialized vessels, and records of distribution, and drinking becomes easier to see. Names survive. Quantities survive. Institutions leave paperwork behind. The liquid slowly comes back into focus. But people did not necessarily invent fermentation at the moment the evidence became easier for us to read. The records simply got better. Picture two early brewers doing the same thing. One uses a ceramic jar. The other uses a skin bag, a wooden bowl, or a woven container. The ceramic jar breaks, but fragments remain. Molecules soak into its walls and stay there. The skin dries out, tears, and disappears. The wood rots. The basket sinks into the soil. The liquid drains away. One person leaves evidence. The other is gone. I think that is the part that hurts a little. The people who lived closest to the true beginning may also be the people least likely to have left us anything we could recognize. Preservation bias cannot prove that some older brewing tradition existed. Claiming that would only replace one overly confident story with another. But it does warn us about the limit of the evidence. The oldest thing that survived is not automatically the first thing people did. So when did early humans start drinking alcohol? Natural exposure could reach far back into our evolutionary past, long before farming. Deliberate fermentation may have appeared among hunter-gatherers before agriculture, with Raqefet offering one of the most important and most debated cases. More securely identified fermented beverages appear later, in vessels such as those from Jiahu, but the first controlled ferment is gone from view. So is the first beverage, and the first person who chose to consume it. They are different beginnings, supported by different amounts of evidence. Those three empty mortars at Raqefet cannot give us the date everyone wants. What they give us is the line between what archaeology actually found and what a satisfying story wants to place on top of it. So the next time you hear that someone has discovered the first beer, ask which first they mean. And remember the empty stretch of timeline behind it. The first drink may be missing, not because it never existed, but because almost everything that held it disappeared.